In a pandemic or any outbreak of contagion, communities living in close proximity face heightened risks. That issue is compounded when the individuals involved are not free to distance themselves or mitigate their behavior. I'm talking about prisons. We're joined remotely by Alexis Hoag, the Practitioner-in-Residence at Columbia Law School, who's recently written a piece on this topic. Professor, welcome.
Thank you so much, Joel.
And maybe we can start with a little bit of background for the audience. I know that there have been a number of news stories about specific jails or prisons afflicted, but what's going on, I guess, broadly?
So the United States is really one of the top countries in the world in terms of the number of people that we incarcerate. And we've got over 2 million people that are serving time in jails, in prisons, both in the federal and the state system. Within that number, it's about 175 individuals that are at federal facilities. Inclusive of that is about 40,000 that are at immigration detention centers. And then you have children in juvenile facilities. In addition to people that are confined in prisons and jails, we have an average of about 10 million people annually that are in and out of jail, almost on a daily basis. And so our infrastructure is quite robust. And I think what COVID-19 has shown is that it's an extremely unstable infrastructure.
It's an interesting point that you raised, that you say that the infrastructure is robust, but with so many individuals incarcerated, perhaps it's no surprise that they're held closely together. That creates a number of challenges when it comes to following guidelines set forth by CDC, for example.
Exactly. Folks are forcibly proximate. And given what we know about COVID-19 and the CDC's recommendations, requirements really, is that people stay socially distant, that they wear masks, that they frequently wash their hands. And the problem in so many of these detention facilities, in prisons, in jails, is that the incarcerated people cannot frequently wash hands. There's a real dearth of hand washing materials, of soap. I have clients that are incarcerated that, they're given a small bar of soap for a period of time, and if it runs out, then they have to actually spend money in commissary to actually obtain more sort of cleaning materials. And so things that we sort of take for granted on the outside are virtually unavailable to incarcerated people. And what I want to make clear is that folks that are incarcerated, you still retain your basic constitutional rights. Your human rights, your human dignity. And what's really clear about folks that are incarcerated is that, they have a right to be free of cruel and unusual punishment.
You mentioned a right to be free of cruel and unusual punishment. Maybe you can give an example of a case before the current epidemic where inmates were able to successfully sue.
Yeah, before the pandemic, we mentioned, at the beginning of our talk that the prison industrial complex is quite large. California is one state in particular where incarcerated people have successfully sued in federal court about conditions of confinement. And so there is legal precedent in California addressing overcrowded prisons, these conditions of confinement. In other federal courts, incarcerated people have successfully sued about other sort of diseases, tuberculosis, scabies, and really this reflects that prisons are petri dishes for communicable diseases even before COVID-19 came on the landscape.
In your article, there was reference to a prison that had high levels of, I believe it was staph infections or some type of superbug. What was going on in that case, and what did the court find?
Yeah, that's an excellent example of the threat and the harm of a communicable disease. And that was litigated in federal court in Pennsylvania in the early 2000s. And something that we're able to take away and present to practitioners and incarcerated people is that you can actually litigate your sort of harm and risk of infection of any sort of disease like that based on the Eighth Amendment. And so it's a two-pronged standard with both a subjective measure and then an objective measure.
Yeah, why don't we take it one at a time? What's the objective measure?
Yeah, so the first of the two measures would be that a prison official is creating has a deliberate indifference to the incarcerated person's they've exposed them to a substantial sort of risk or an unreasonable risk of harm. And so that first part, that there's deliberate indifference, is what is subjective. And so the prison official actually has to know about the harm and deliberately ignore what either the CDC protocol is or access to sort of medical care. And it's that second prong, that the substantial risk, which would be objective.
Deliberate risk seems like a relatively high standard. Do you have to show not only that they're not taking certain measures, but that it would be easy for them to do so, or that they have the resources to do so?
Exactly. It is a quite high burden, but I think what we've seen in federal facilities, particularly the facility Oakdale in Louisiana, there's another facility in Ohio, a third in Connecticut, where it's quite clear what the prison officials should be doing. The CDC was quite clear about what the appropriate protocol should be, and that the prison was not adhering to that. And so it wasn't so much just the wardens, it was the correctional officers, the vendors, counselors, nurses, people that work regularly in and out of facilities, and then create a potential for a public health risk when they go home to their own families, when they go to their own communities.
That's another important point that you make, that it's not just inmates who are at risk, but also the staff that work at the facilities and the communities where they're located.
Yeah, Joel, that's exactly right. And that's why we should all be concerned. It's not just the 2 million people that are incarcerated, it's all of the people that come in and out of facilities that are the essential workers. And they're the ones that are especially at risk of not just contracting the virus, but also spreading the virus once they're inside a facility.
So step one was deliberate indifference. And then the second test was objective, and that was substantial risk?
That the prison officials have put an incarcerated person at a substantial risk of serious harm. It could be a substantial risk or an unreasonable risk.
So in a pandemic situation, a substantial risk should be rather easier to show than the deliberate indifference.
Exactly. And so much about the structure of prisons forcibly puts people proximate to each other. I have clients incarcerated in state facilities in Mississippi where it's a large sort of bunk bed situation, sort of a large dormitory where it's not even individual cells. And so the beds are actually stacked on top of each other with 10s, 20s, 30 or plus more incarcerated people confined in a space together, eating meals together in close proximity, utilizing bathroom facilities, again, in close proximity. And there's really no way to not be close to people.
And these inmates kind of run the spectrum in terms of age, and many of whom would qualify as very high-risk individuals for the current virus.
Yeah, and given the really punitive measures that our country began to take in the 80s and 90s, the prison population exploded numerical-wise, and then also in terms of the length of sentences. And so in the United States, we have one of the oldest prison populations, and this is exactly the population that's highest risk for contracting COVID-19. And then so many incarcerated people also have pre-existing conditions, hypertension, diabetes. Again, these are all substantial risk factors for contracting the virus. So this is an extremely vulnerable population of individuals.
If the inmates are actually successful with their lawsuits, both tests are met, what obligations are then put on the prisons? It's not necessarily the case that they would be released.
Yeah, that's a great question of remedy. And so you're right, Joel. Not necessarily would somebody obtain release as a remedy with a successful Eighth Amendment argument. Instead, it would be that the prison would have to take the appropriate steps, the appropriate medical steps to decrease that risk. And so it would be that the incarcerated individual would have access to materials to frequently wash hands, would have access to a face mask, would have access to testing to determine whether or not they're positive for the virus. And then also implementing measures that would enable people to be socially distant while confined. In terms of obtaining release, there has been a recommendation from the Attorney General William Barr to consider compassionate release of incarcerated individuals, and that's folks that are very close in time to completing their sentence. They're in a vulnerable population, quite elderly, and then the remedy then could be sort of monitored home confinement. But for the type of litigation we're talking about, it would be for the prison officials to actually take steps to protect the spread of the virus and actually being able to follow and implement the CDC protocols and guidelines.
This hopefully will be the last pandemic we'll face as a nation, but that is not very likely. Professor, what do you see going forward? How will the system react to epidemics or pandemics in the future?
Yeah, Joel, I think what this pandemic has really revealed, not just in the criminal legal system, but in all other contexts, is that the infrastructure in the United States is broken. In this country, we sentence so many people to prison for such a long time. And I think moving forward from COVID-19, local jurisdictions, the federal government is going to think sort of twice and more critically about the sheer number of individuals that we lock up in prison for as long as we do.
Alexis Hoag, thank you for your time and for your insight on this matter.
It was a real pleasure to be on TalksOnLaw and to highlight the work that my colleagues and my students at Columbia Law engaged in.
And we'll include some additional resources for viewers below in the information section, so you should take a look.